Have you ever met someone who seemed incredibly confident, even though they clearly weren't very good at what they were doing? Maybe it was a coworker, a manager, a speaker, or someone on social media who seemed absolutely convinced that they had all of the answers. Then, have you ever met someone else who was exceptionally talented, highly experienced, deeply knowledgeable, and yet constantly questioned whether they were good enough? It's an interesting contradiction. One person overestimates their abilities, the other underestimates them. So, what's going on? Why does the brain sometimes get confidence so wrong? Well, most people assume confidence is a personality trait, something that you're either born with or you're not. But neuroscience paints a much different picture. Confidence isn't simply something you have, it's something that your brain builds. And surprisingly, it's constantly updating that estimate based on one thing: evidence. And today we're going to explore why your brain believes the evidence, how small, consistent actions shape your identity, why beginners often feel more confident than experts, why successful people still struggle with imposter syndrome, and how understanding the science behind confidence can help you stop waiting to believe in yourself and start giving your brain a reason to. Welcome to the Personal Mastery and Growth Podcast, where we explore the keys to unlocking your full potential and living your best life. I'm your host, Jose Johnson. Whether you're looking to make a breakthrough, overcome a challenge, or simply live with greater clarity, joy, and purpose, you'll find the tools and inspirations you need right here. So let's start your journey towards personal mastery and growth right now. Welcome back to the Personal Mastery and Growth Podcast, your go-to resource for practical tips, insightful research, and inspiring stories to help you unlock your full potential. I'm your host, Jose Johnson, and I'm an expert in the fields of mindfulness, mindset, and peak performance, and I am so excited to have you here with me today. Now, over the past several episodes, we have explored how your intention shapes your experience, why action creates momentum, how life transitions challenge your identity, and most recently, why accepting reality frees us to move forward instead of staying stuck. Now, each of those conversations has been building towards a bigger idea. Your brain is constantly learning. It's always adapting, always updating its understanding of the world and of you, which naturally leads to another important question. How does your brain decide what you're actually capable of? Why do some people grow more confident over time while others continue doubting themselves, even after years of success? Well, today we're going to explore what neuroscience, psychology, and human behavior can teach us about confidence, competence, self-doubt, and identity. And more importantly, we're going to discover that lasting confidence isn't something that you magically find. It's something that you gradually build. So let's dive in. All right, so a few years ago, I noticed something interesting in my own life. Whether I was writing a book, preparing a keynote, producing a podcast, or composing an arrangement for my band, there was always a moment where I questioned whether I could pull it off. Uh, Not because I'd never done it before. In fact, I'd done all of those things many, many times. But every new project came with its own uncertainty. Now, does that sound familiar? I think most of us assume that successful people eventually reach a point where they stop doubting themselves. Well, in my experience, that rarely happens. What changes isn't that the questions disappear. What changes is the evidence that you've accumulated. You begin remembering all of the other times you didn't have everything figured out and somehow figured it out anyway. That's when I started thinking about the way our brains make decisions. Right? So imagine that your mind is like a courtroom, and every single day, evidence is being presented. You kept your promise to yourself today. That's evidence. You avoided the difficult conversation. That's evidence. You practice your instrument. Evidence. You put off the workout. Also evidence. Now, none of these moments determine the verdict by themselves. But over time, your brain begins noticing patterns, and eventually it reaches conclusions. Not because you told yourself a positive affirmation, not because someone complimented you, but because your experiences have given your brain reason to believe certain things about who you are. Now, that's why I often say your brain believes the evidence. And once you understand that, something fascinating begins to happen. You stop asking, how do I become more confident? And you begin asking, what evidence am I giving my brain today? Now, that one shift changes everything because confidence isn't usually where the story begins. Competence is. If your brain is constantly collecting evidence, then the next logical question is, where does confidence actually come from? Now, most of us have been taught that confidence comes first. Once I feel confident, I'll apply for the promotion. Once I feel confident, I'll start the business. Once I feel confident, I'll speak up in the meeting. Once I feel confident, I'll finally write that book. That sounds pretty reasonable. But the problem is, that's usually not how the brain works. In many cases, confidence isn't the cause of action. It's the result of action. Right? Think about learning to drive a car. The first time you got behind the wheel, you probably weren't overflowing with confidence. You were thinking about mirrors, turn signals, speed limits, brake pedals, and trying not to hit anything. It felt awkward, maybe even a little terrifying. But something interesting happened. The more you drove, the more your brain collected evidence. I merged onto the highway. I parallel parked. I drove in the rain. I made it through rush hour. Each experience became another piece of evidence. Not dramatic, not particularly life-changing, just another quiet reminder to your brain that I've done this before. And eventually, what once felt impossible became automatic. Not because you suddenly decided to believe in yourself, but because your brain had accumulated enough evidence to stop treating driving like a threat. Now, psychologists often refer to this as self-efficacy, a concept that was developed by Albert Bandura. Self-efficacy is your belief that you can successfully perform a specific task. And according to decades of research, the single most powerful way to build that belief isn't positive thinking. It's mastery experiences. In other words, successfully doing the thing, even in small ways. Bandura found that every successful experience gives your brain another reason to believe that you're capable. Not because someone encouraged you, not because you repeated an affirmation, but because you actually experienced success. Now, that's why I think confidence and competence are best understood as a loop. Competence creates confidence. Confidence makes you more willing to act. More action builds greater competence, which creates even more confidence, and the cycle begins feeding itself. But unfortunately, the opposite is also true. If you avoid difficult conversations, you never gain experience having them. And without experience, your brain has very little evidence that you can actually handle them. So the next conversation just feels as intimidating as the last one, which you avoid again. And now the brain has collected a different kind of evidence. Maybe this isn't something I'm good at. Now, do you see how subtle that is? Your brain isn't trying to sabotage you. It's simply making predictions based on the evidence available. Now, that's why waiting to feel confident before taking action often keeps us stuck. Confidence usually doesn't arrive before the first step. It catches up afterwards. And that's good news, because it means you don't have to manufacture confidence. You simply have to begin creating better evidence. Now, if confidence grows from experience, why do some people seem incredibly confident even when they have very little experience at all? That's where things get really interesting. So let's talk about one of psychology's most misunderstood discoveries. All right, so if competence builds confidence, why do some people seem so confident before they've developed much competence at all? We've all met that person, the one who walks into the room with complete certainty. They have an opinion about everything, an answer for every question, and somehow they're never wrong. Well, at least not in their own mind. Meanwhile, the person sitting quietly in the corner, the one with years of experience, is thinking, I'm not sure I know enough to weigh in. So how does that happen? Well, psychologists, they've been studying this phenomenon for years. And one of the most fascinating explanations is something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. In simple terms, it suggests that people with very little knowledge or experience in a particular area often overestimate their abilities. And not particularly because they're arrogant, not because they're trying to fool anyone, but because they don't yet know what they don't know. So think about it this way. Imagine you've just learned to play a few songs on the guitar. At that moment, you might think, hey, I'm getting pretty good at this. Then you meet someone who's been playing professionally for 20 years. Suddenly you realize there are techniques you've never heard of, styles you've never explored, and skills that you didn't even know existed. The more you learn, the more you become aware of just how much there is still to learn. I've experienced this throughout my own life. Whether it was studying martial arts, performing professionally as a musician, or coaching leaders, there is a point where I realized that mastery isn't about knowing everything. It's about appreciating the depth of what you're still learning. Now, ironically, that's often where real growth begins. I sometimes joke that the older I get, the smarter my teachers become. When I was 20, I thought I understood almost everything they were trying to teach me. Now I look back and realize they were playing chess while I was still figuring out checkers. Experience has a funny way of replacing certainty with curiosity. And that's not a weakness, it's a sign of growth. In fact, I've become a little suspicious of people who are absolutely certain about everything. Life has taught me that the more you genuinely understand, the more comfortable you become saying, I don't know, or I need to learn more. Look, that's not insecurity. That is wisdom. But there's another side to this conversation. If beginners sometimes overestimate themselves, why do highly capable people often underestimate themselves? Why do accomplished professionals, successful leaders, talented artists, and high performers still wrestle with the feeling that someday someone's going to discover that they don't belong? Now, that's a very different psychological challenge. And chances are you've experienced it yourself. So let's talk about imposter syndrome. All right, so if the Dunning-Kruger effect teaches us that some people overestimate their abilities, imposter syndrome reminds us that many capable people do exactly the opposite. Despite years of experience, despite accomplishments, despite evidence to the contrary, they still wonder if they're good enough. Now, maybe you felt that way before. You start a new leadership position, you launch a business, you accept a speaking engagement, you publish a book, you earn a promotion. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet voice asks, what if they discover I don't belong here? Now, here's what's interesting. That feeling isn't always a sign that you're unqualified. Sometimes it's just a sign that you're growing. In episode 93, I mentioned that I'd actually be a little concerned if someone wasn't uncomfortable during a major life transition. Growth is supposed to stretch you. It introduces uncertainty. It asks you to operate before you have all of the answers. And I think imposter syndrome often works the same way. If you've ever experienced it, one of two things might be happening. Either you're staying comfortably inside the boundaries of what you've already mastered, or you're dramatically overestimating your abilities. Now, neither one leads to much growth. The people I know who continue learning, who keep improving, who keep challenging themselves, almost always experience moments where they wonder if they're ready. not because they're incapable, but because they're standing in unfamiliar territory. Now, think back to the first time that you led a team, the first time you became a parent, the first time you spoke in front of hundreds of people, the first time you walked into a new position where everyone expected you to know what you were doing. Of course, it felt uncomfortable. You've never been there before. Your brain was doing exactly what brains do. It was trying to predict the outcome of a situation with very little evidence. But over time, something changes. Not because the fear magically disappears, but because the evidence starts piling up. You lead another meeting, then another. You solve a difficult problem. You recover from a mistake. You navigate conflict. You earn trust. Little by little, your brain begins updating its prediction. Not because someone told you that you belong, but because you demonstrated that you do. And that is an important distinction. Confidence doesn't require the absence of doubt. It simply requires enough evidence that you can keep moving despite the doubt. Now, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that we have about successful people. We imagine they eventually stop feeling uncertain. But in reality, many of them just became more comfortable walking forward before certainty arrives. Because they've learned something the rest of us sometimes forget. Growth almost always feels unfamiliar before it feels natural. But here's where our brains become especially fascinating. Once we start believing a story about ourselves, whether it's positive or negative, our brains begin searching for evidence to support that story. And that's where another powerful psychological principle enters the picture: confirmation bias. Throughout this episode, we've been talking about the evidence your brain collects. But here's something even more fascinating. Your brain doesn't just collect evidence. It also decides which evidence gets your attention. And that's where confirmation bias comes in. Now, confirmation bias often gets a bad reputation. People usually talk about it as though it's some kind of flaw in our thinking. I don't see it that way. Confirmation bias isn't good or bad. It's simply one of the brain's shortcuts. Right? So remember, your brain is processing an incredible amount of information every second. If it tried to analyze every single detail equally, we'd never get anything done. So instead, it creates filters. And those filters help determine what gets noticed and what gets ignored. Now, in many ways, confirmation bias is your brain's way of saying, I've seen this pattern before. I'll pay closer attention to things that seem to support it. Now, that is incredibly efficient. It's also incredibly powerful because whatever story you've been telling yourself, your brain quietly starts looking for evidence that supports it. If you believe I'm terrible at public speaking, guess what your brain notices? The one sentence you stumbled over, the moment your voice cracked, the audience member checking their phone. Meanwhile, it completely overlooks the dozens of people who were engaged, the compliments afterwards, and the fact that someone invited you back to speak again. Now, the opposite is also true. If you genuinely begin believing, I'm becoming a better communicator, your brain starts noticing something different. You handled that difficult question better than the last time. You were more relaxed. You remembered your opening. Someone thanked you afterwards. Same brain, same room, but a completely different filter. And that's why confirmation bias is neither your enemy nor your best friend. It's just a tool. The question is, what are you training it to look for? So that reminds me of something we discussed back in episode 89 when we explored cognitive biases in depth. One of the practices I shared was intentionally asking yourself each morning what good things might happen today. And each evening, taking a few moments to write down what actually went well. Some people hear that and think it's just positive thinking, but it isn't. It's intentional attention. You're teaching your brain to notice evidence that might otherwise go unnoticed, not by pretending the difficult things don't exist, but by making sure the good things don't become invisible. Right? Think about buying a new car, and maybe you've had this experience. You decided on a particular make and model. Suddenly, you see that car everywhere. Did everyone rush out and buy one overnight? Of course not. They're always there. Your brain simply decided they were now relevant. Life works exactly the same way. If your brain is convinced that you're incapable, it will become remarkably good at spotting evidence that supports that conclusion. If your brain begins gathering evidence that you're growing, that you're learning, that you're becoming more resilient, it starts noticing those moments too. Again, not because reality changed, but because your attention changed. And over time, those small moments begin reinforcing a healthier, more accurate story about who you are. Which brings us back to where the entire episode began. Your brain is constantly evaluating the evidence. But the beautiful part is you have far more influence over that evidence than you probably realize. So if confidence grows through experience, if imposter syndrome can be a sign of growth, and if confirmation bias helps shape the evidence your brain notices, then one final question remains. How do we intentionally use all of this? How do we stop waiting to become more confident and start becoming the kind of person our brain can't help but believe in? So let's finish by talking about how to become your own best evidence. Hey there, feeling stuck? Spinning your wheels? Are you ready for a breakthrough? Well, then you need to hear this because I've got something that will supercharge your growth this year, and it's called the Mindset Makeover. Now, it's my new book and course that are designed to help you upgrade the mental software that drives your success. And inside, you're going to discover the mindsets that shape every decision, every habit, and every result. And you'll learn the science-backed tools to rewire your thinking for clarity, confidence, and unstoppable momentum. So whether you're aiming higher, trying to break free from old patterns, or finally stepping into that version of yourself that you know that you're capable of becoming, well, this is your launch pad. So don't wait. Head over to josejohnson.com/mindset to grab the book, join the course, or get both together. Again, that's josejohnson.com/mindset. And remember, it is what it is, but it becomes what you make it. And with the Mindset Makeover, you can make it something extraordinary. All right, so as we begin wrapping up today's conversation, I'd like to leave you with one simple idea. Stop waiting for confidence. Start creating evidence. Now, think about everything we've explored today. Confidence isn't something that you're born with. It's something your brain gradually builds. Competence grows through action. Imposter syndrome often shows up when you're stretching into new territory. Confirmation bias influences which experience your brain notices and remembers. Now, none of these things are happening to you. They're happening for you. They're all part of the incredible way your brain learns, adapts, and predicts the future. The question is, what future are you teaching it to expect? Every promise you keep to yourself is evidence. Every workout you complete, that's evidence. Every difficult conversation you have is evidence. Every chapter that you write, every practice session, every healthy choice, every time you choose courage over comfort, your brain takes notice. Maybe not dramatically, maybe not overnight, but consistently. And consistency is what changes identity. Now, one of the biggest mistakes we make is believing that life changes because of one huge breakthrough. Now, look, sometimes that does happen. But more often than not, life changes because of hundreds of ordinary moments that quietly begin pointing us in a new direction. And that's encouraging because it means that you don't have to become a completely different person tomorrow. You just have to give your brain one more piece of evidence today than you did yesterday. One more vote for the person that you're becoming. James Clear writes in Atomic Habits that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Now, I think neuroscience helps explain why that's true. Those votes become evidence. That evidence shapes your belief. Those beliefs influence your future actions. And before long, the person you once hoped to become begins feeling like the person that you've always been. Not because you wished for it, but because you lived it. So this week, instead of asking yourself, do I feel confident? Try asking a different question. What evidence am I creating today? Maybe it's making the phone call you've been avoiding. Maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's finally signing up for that class. Maybe it's apologizing to someone. Maybe it's writing one page. Maybe it's practicing for 15 minutes instead of waiting for the perfect hour. Now, none of those actions seem life-changing by themselves, but your brain is paying attention. It always is. And little by little, it begins reaching a different conclusion about who you are because your brain believes the evidence. So give it something worth believing. So thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. I hope today's conversation reminds you that confidence isn't reserved for a lucky few. It's something that we build, one experience, one decision, and one small act of courage at a time. And before we wrap up, I have one final challenge for you. If today's episode helped you shift your perspective, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, share it with a friend, or drop a comment letting me know what resonated with you. Those simple actions help more people discover the show because just like your brain, the algorithm is looking for evidence. Every subscription, every review, every comment, every share is another piece of evidence that these conversations are making a difference. And that's how the community grows. And if you'd like to continue exploring practical ways to strengthen your mindset, improve your focus, and intentionally design the life you want, be sure to check out the resources linked in the show notes, including my new Attention Reset Challenge and the growing collection of articles and challenges on my Substack. So until next time, remember, it is what it is, but it becomes what you make it. So make it great. Thanks for tuning in. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind you that the information shared in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional advice or treatment. While the content of this podcast is based on research and personal experience, everyone's situation is unique, and the advice given may not be applicable to all. Always consult a qualified professional before making significant changes in your life. The Personal Mastery and Growth podcast is recorded at the So Good Media Studios located in the Candy Factory, a co-working space in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.